Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing environmental lawyer of 35 years, Larry Schnapf. He is also an adjunct professor of environmental law at New York Law School. We discussed a variety of topics, really interesting stuff from brownfields and Superfund sites to living in New Jersey, as I do now, and his history of living in New Jersey. We get into environmental law, old history, and of course, the new chemicals that are invading our world as we speak, and also what to ask as a new homeowner or new purchaser of any property. So stay tuned and enjoy this wonderful interview with Mr. Larry Schnapf. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smart Human Podcast. Today, we have a really interesting person that I'm interviewing, Larry Schnapf, who is an environmental lawyer of over 35 years. He grew up in Matawan, New Jersey, and then went on to Rutgers undergrad, as well as New York Law School for law school training. He is also an adjunct professor as well of environmental law at New York Law School. And he has a very colorful background, including being on the board of the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame. We are going to talk lots of different interesting topics with Larry today. And so let me welcome you, Larry. Thanks for being on our show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let me start by saying, how did we even get to know each other? I think I could tell you that a little briefly. I haven't told a lot of people this, but I'm having a battle with glyphosate in my neighborhood and in my backyard in central New Jersey with the farmer that wants to spray it. And, it got a little heated and I had to figure out at what angles I was going to take to see if I could kind of thwart this spraying. And I actually went on to LinkedIn and I started looking around to find an environmental lawyer. And of course, you showed up. And now I'm just thrilled to read your posts. And you're full of color and you're full of interest. And I'm just really thrilled to meet you. So I have you on to talk about a bunch of topics, including brownfields and Superfund sites and certain chemicals, and certainly your experience with environmental law, which I'm sure is really long and interesting. So welcome and thanks for being on again.
Well, I'm delighted, and at least I know now that at least one person was following my LinkedIn post.
Well, actually, I love them. Actually, I think they're so interesting. So tell me a little bit about yourself, Larry. How did you get into environmental law as an actual specialty off of law?
Well, I was the environment became an issue for me when I was born in the Bronx and we moved to Matawan when I was 10. And at that point in time, Matawan was in the middle of nowhere. There was no development around there. And suddenly, I guess in high school, the towns around me started getting developed. I saw all these really cool farms being paved over into housing developments in Marlborough and other places. And that really, I really didn't like the fact that, we were losing our farmland. In addition, every time I would drive on the Parkway, I would drive by a landfill that turned out to be a Superfund site. But despite that, when I went to college, there was no environmental law yet. The only real environmental law in the early 70s was the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And we used to kid around that the only people that went into environmental law were tree huggers and critter lovers. So there wasn't much of an opportunity to do anything with that. And then when I went to law school was finally when the Superfund program was passed. But even then, it wasn't until the mid 80s that the Superfund program began affecting property owners and operators of businesses that were not typically thought of as polluters. And the way it happened for me was after law school I got a job at the Hertz Corporation. I was working there before I went to law school, while I was in law school also. And I was hired as a real estate lawyer. And most of our car rental locations were former gas stations. So one day I get a call from the partner and he comes to the head of the department and says, "You were a geology major in college, right?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "You know about the earth, right?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, you're our environmental lawyer."
For Hertz.
For Hertz, right. And then I went over to a bank, and the bank, they hired me because I could document deals. I was mainly worked on, transactions. And I said, I have this environmental experience. And they said, oh, we don't care about that. And then 6 months later, they had a borrower who was a former textile mill. They foreclosed on it. And suddenly they wanted to know about my environmental experience because the textile mill had all kinds of contamination. So I had this, there are other stories as well. It seems like I was destined to be an environmental lawyer.
Yeah, it seems like you were pushed into a lot of different situations where you started to question what's going on here. But it is still, it's a unique field, and I don't think it's teeming with people, is it? Is it relatively small even now, or do you think it's expanded over the years since we've become kind of sort of dirty as a country in many ways with chemical pollution?
Well, it's interesting. In the 80s, it became the hot field for lawyers to go into, and then it contracted. And now, um, you know, just about every firm has an environmental lawyer. So it's not a great growth area. I think it's going to start expanding again. It's becoming also kind of merged with clean energy. So I think we'll get I think, and also this generation of students appears to be more environmentally aware than others. The prior generations were more interested in banking and real estate, and the environmental angle was to how to help with their deals. Whereas now the students seem to be more motivated about environmental issues, less how is it going to help my real estate practice or my investment banking career.
Interesting. And so you teach a couple courses, right, at New York Law School, right? Which courses do you teach?
So I teach the basic environmental law class,
Hmm.
and then I have a mini brownfield class, and we'll talk about brownfields in a second. That it's basically 2 days, 2 full days between the first and the fall and the spring semester. I also teach a class on occasion called Environmental Issues and Business Transactions, which is where most of the lawyers today that are environmental lawyers get involved, is where property is changing hands or corporations are being sold. And a lot of the environmental issues that have not been addressed come up in the transaction because the buyers are concerned about getting stuck with the liability. So it's actually the transactions that oftentimes expose the environmental issues. New Jersey has had a very innovative law that they passed in 1983. New Jersey is a very small state and is densely populated, and also is probably had one of the most industrial states as well. So almost everybody in New Jersey was living close to an industrial facility. And when we started deindustrializing in the early 80s, New Jersey passed a law that said you can't just abandon these properties. If you're going to close the properties or you're going to transfer them, you have to investigate and then clean them up. And that was actually probably New Jersey, at one point, by the way, was considered the leading state in the country on environmental issues.
Really?
Yes.
Is that because they had to, because it's one of the dirtiest states, or is that because they wanted to?
There was an old joke in the early 80s about why does New Jersey have the most toxic waste sites and New York the most lawyers? And the answer was that New Jersey had first choice. But yeah, I mean, I think New Jersey, we had a lot of sites, and we had some pretty high profile sites. There was a site that blew up in 1980. I was actually on the turnpike coming home from a Yankee game when that happened. It was in Elizabeth, and you could see drums going up in the air from the explosion. It had been improper storage of waste. They were storing incompatible waste with each other, and it resulted in an explosion. So New Jersey had a lot of dumps, a lot of industry, and so it was on the cutting edge of environmental legislation and regulation for the longest time. Not now, but it was then.
Wow, that's interesting. And now, you're a Jersey person. I'm a Jersey person. You from Jersey. I'm from Jersey. Would exit. We have interesting topics here in New Jersey, and things that are personal. Of course, we're the farming state. The garden state, I should say, which means we do spray a lot of toxins, a lot of pesticides. But we also have some, what I think the highest number of Superfund sites in the country. I think in our book, my book that just came out, Non-Toxic, we talked about as of 2020, New Jersey had 105 Superfund sites. California was second with 97, and Pennsylvania with 95. And so, we have a pretty dirty state comparatively across the country in terms of these areas. So, could you explain to us, Larry, and the audience, what's a Superfund site, what's a brownfield site, and why is that so really important in terms of water and some other really vital issues for everyday people?
Well, a Superfund site there are about roughly 1,700 sites across the country. Superfund program was enacted in 1980 at the waning days of the Carter administration in response primarily to the Love Canal
Yes.
problem in upstate New York and Niagara, but there was some other ones, the Valley of the Drums in Tennessee. But what happened was in the 1970s, we started having the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, which all the pollution that was going in the water and in the air was now being captured by pollution controls. And they had to find a place to put it. So they started putting it in dumps. And then in the mid 1970s, we came up with when we started realizing we're generating all this hazardous waste, well, they came up with a new law called the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is a cradle to grave management process for managing hazardous waste. The generators had to do things, and then the transporters had to take them to licensed facilities. What that did was make it very expensive to dump waste.
Mm-hmm.
So then we started having lots of illegal waste sites, oftentimes, at least in the Northeast, run by the mafia.
Yeah.
And so the Superfund law was passed. Again, every time we passed the law, there was an unintended consequence. So the Superfund law was passed in 1980 to address this problem of abandoned Superfund hazardous waste sites. And that law, so they basically, Congress gave EPA, or the president who then gave EPA, the authority to identify the worst sites in the country, put them on a list called the Superfund list, and then they would be cleaned up. And the EPA would then they had a 5-year Superfund. The money was used to clean up these sites, and then the government could pursue the responsible parties, which were identified by status. So you could be an owner of a facility, an operator, a transporter, or a generator. Well, it turned out that the problem was way more than 5 years. By some estimates, we have over 200,000 contaminated sites in the country. So if you think about Superfund having 1,700,
right,
Superfund program only captures a small fraction of the contaminated sites, and many of these sites are unknown because of the way the laws were written. So one of the things Superfund program created was this requirement to disclose releases of hazardous substance. Think of spills. And then that made sense in the early 1980s when there was lots of mismanagement. But now what we have primarily is historic contamination. So something happened 40 years ago. It's no longer a factory. Now it's a commercial office building. And they're starting to build it, and they discover contamination. The question is, do they have to report it? And the way the rules are set up, the reporting obligations are premised on a spill of X amount of volume over a 24-hour period, which made sense when you had ongoing mismanagement. But when you have historic contamination, you don't know if that was drip, drip, drip over 20 years, or did a bucket spill. And so a lot of the contamination is not reported. So that's one of the problems. But the Superfund sites are a one way that you can clean up a site. We have an underground storage tank program. So a lot of gas stations have underground storage tanks, but a lot of other properties in the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, have fuel oil tanks that is used to heat the oil, heat the buildings, or So what the problem with all these things, what they can do is there's 3 ways that people can get exposed to the contamination. One is they can breathe the air, or breathe the dust that's contaminated, that's blown across the property. Another is they can drink the groundwater that's contaminated, or the third is they can breathe in vapors coming from the contamination. So the Superfund program historically was focused on the groundwater. Do you want me to go into more evolution about how the program has evolved?
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening. I'm fascinated because I think a lot of people listening, are just blown away by the fact that there are so many thousands of contaminated sites that may not fall under the heading of a super fund, but maybe under a brownfield title. But then there's also, military bases that no one considers Superfund sites, but actually, in effect, are. So we know contamination there in their water system. A lot of military bases. So yeah, please keep going because I find this fascinating.
So actually, just before we get into the evolution, so one of the most common sources of contamination are gas stations and dry cleaners. Now, dry cleaners are like, even though they're small businesses, they're like little mini factories because of the chlorinated solvents that they use. And unfortunately, they have oftentimes been mismanaged. The joke is if you go outside the back of the dry cleaner, you turn left for 10 feet and take a soil sample, you'll find that's contamination because that's where they stored the leaky drum.
Wow.
Waste. But the problem with the chlorinated solvents is the stuff doesn't degrade in the environment. And there have been many, many cases of dry cleaners becoming Superfund sites. In fact, in New York, we have over 200 dry cleaners on the state Superfund list. By the way, so while the federal government has a Superfund program, almost every state, I'd say 49 states, have their own Superfund programs.
Okay.
Separate from the federal program. So and what qualifies as a Superfund site on a state level is different. It varies from state to state. So these, when groundwater gets contaminated, we call that a plume. Just think about when you see a smokestack and you see smoke coming from that. That's like an aerial. That's like an air. Think about that smoke. Think about that in the water. So it sort of migrates along, and some of these plumes can go like a mile long. And there have been a number of cases where dry cleaners have contaminated the drinking water supply of neighborhoods. Now, dry cleaners tend to be located near residential communities because it's convenient.
Right.
So not only, so they don't have to really have a contaminated zone that goes very far. And the other thing that we've learned about these kinds of contaminants, these what they call volatile organic compounds, there are compounds that evaporate easily. So historically, EPA was concerned about people drinking groundwater or getting in touch with soil that's contaminated, and you can easily eliminate the soil problem by just paving over the dirty dirt. And if no one's drinking the groundwater, then in theory, no one's being exposed to the drinking water, the contaminated drinking water.
So those are for wells. In other words, people who have municipal tap have sort of, piped in water through PVC piping or whatever old infrastructure, which have its own issues. But again, you're talking about primarily businesses with residential areas that are using well water as their main source of drinking water.
Yes. So what we learned from the evolving science in the late 90s was that the assumptions that if groundwater was deeper than 15 feet, that there was no risk of these evaporating chemicals getting into buildings. In fact, that's not true. It really depends on a number of factors. But the problem is the buildings themselves can actually create negative air pressure that draws the vapors from the groundwater through the soil. And soil is not like rock. Soil is mainly air with particles like touching each other. And then it draws these contaminants into the building. So as a result, there are dry cleaners that have resulted in, they have these plumes that go underneath residential properties, and the buildings, the homes begin getting vapors coming up from the ground. We had a big problem in Seagirt, not Seagirt, 33 and 34 come together. I forgot that town now, but there was a dry cleaner at the Circle, and they had septic systems, which, by the way, are classic ways that ground contamination gets into the ground. They are oftentimes serve small shopping strips, strip malls, and dry cleaners, and water gets in the ground, the chemicals get in the ground. So at this particular place, the plume went from this circle, this traffic circle, all the way to the ocean.
Wow.
So all the homes were asked. It became a Superfund site. The homeowners were asked to put in these basically like these radon systems, these subslab systems, and believe it or not, many homeowners declined to put these systems in their homes because they were afraid what it would do to their property values. And that's a problem we
Hmm.
have oftentimes with this particular situation is people decline. You would think that they would be very concerned about contamination coming into their house, but they're also worried about the property value. And so they are A, afraid to have sampling done, and B, they don't want this system put in place because then it kind of, there's a presumption that their property is contaminated. And I don't know if you have each of your neighbors having this system and yours don't. I don't understand the thinking that means your property is clean, but that has been a problem. So this vapor intrusion has become probably one of the leading environmental issues that we have in this particular part of the country, especially since people are using city water for the most part. And so therefore the thinking was, well, there's no exposure. They're not exposed to the dirty dirt. They're not exposed to the water, groundwater. So there's no risk.
So the vapor is basically the issue. It's not so much the water, it's how it comes out of the soil and kind of gets into the environment. It's in certainly homes and businesses. That's interesting.
Yeah. And this is, now becoming it's one of the hot topics in environmental across the country. In some states, depending on where you are, some states have different rules about how to deal with this and when you have to deal with it. So, there are some states like Texas that basically allow you to ignore the problem.
Wow.
So they have this thing where if the groundwater is not being used, they just pretend it's not there.
Hmm.
And therefore, the fact that you're having vapors coming in your building or your home, it it's not even on the radar screen. Whereas New York and New Jersey are very proactive about this, and they have different standards at what point you have to take action or not take action. So that is one of the hot things that you should actually people should think about. That even if they're not using their groundwater for drinking water, but what happens also is if you are using your groundwater, it also can get you. You can also get exposed by showers
Hmm.
because
Right.
and irrigation wells and stuff. So that's a big issue that is of concern. So you can be a mile away from a Superfund site, and your home could potentially, be impacted by that site. Now, New Jersey has a disclosure law that if a new home contractor is building a subdivision, and they're near a Superfund site, they have to disclose it. But that's for new construction. So that's limited. Now, some states have these property condition disclosure forms that sellers are supposed to give to buyers when they're selling homes. And, the typical things are asbestos, lead paint, but the penalty for not filling out this form is like in New York is like a $500 penalty. So if somebody fills the form out and makes a mistake or makes a misrepresentation, their liability is not capped at $500.
Right.
So in New York, we actually have a split in how this is handled. Downstate, say New York City and its suburbs and Long Island, basically the seller just takes the $500 off and doesn't give the buyer the form. Upstate, they tend to fill out the form. And the reason they don't do it downstate is because they're afraid of having, unlimited liability for if they made a misrepresentation.
Wow. And so what would you tell a homeowner? I mean, just in terms of, practical information. Say you're maybe you're moving out of the city. Maybe coronavirus was one of the reasons why you left. There's a lot of people moving around right now and trying to figure out. And we know that, of course, Migration from climate change is going to happen at some point in terms of coastal living, in terms of tornado zones, in terms of heat. What do you recommend when you go to I'm sure it's state by state, but what are your general rules for an average home buyer who wants to buy, and in terms of what they should be testing for on the very basic level?
So part of it's going to depend on the age of the structure. But if you're buying an old house, and I would say, for purposes of what I'm about to say, built before, say, 1978 or say 1980s is a round number, you want to check for lead paint. Lead paint is a neurotoxin, which means for the first 6 years of life, there's no barrier in the brain preventing lead from getting into the brain. So that's why the regulations about lead paint deal with children 6 years and under. So you want to know if there's lead paint in your house. And the typical test that they use is a cotton swab that they just put on the surface. And that's not going to tell you if there's lead paint underneath. So that test could show no lead paint because the surface paint, if it's been painted in the last 30 years, there's no lead in the paint. So what you want to do is either take a paint chip or do what they call X-ray fracs, do an X-ray of underneath the paint. Also, a lot of times people like to, when they're renovating their homes by themselves, they're going to heat the paint to remove it. Don't do that, because if you start seeing, especially in the city, I've got all these psychedelic colors in my first apartment from the 60s. And the reason of those bright colors was because they had lead in them.
Got it.
Lead holds the color in the paint. So you want to be concerned about lead paint.
Is that for inside and outside? So the outdoor paint as well doesn't just mean the indoor paint. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the outdoor paint, so the way that the outdoor paint, the way paint looks fresh is that it sheds its external level. And so you can have lead flaking off. If you have lead paint on the exterior of your house, the lead can actually flake off and get into the soil. And if you have young kids who are digging in the soil, and kids love to eat lead because it's sweet. And the sources, the biggest sources of lead exposure are the friction surfaces. So like when you open and closing windows, opening and closing doors, anything where the kid can reach. So you want to make sure that, so you can have paint in good condition everywhere except the windows. And if the windows are low enough, the kids could reach them. And also, as I said, lead paint outside that falls outside into the dirt.
I've heard of people growing tomatoes outside of their front of their house, and within a certain footage of the house itself, the lead actually gets absorbed through the tomato plants, and you can actually test that in the plant. It's in the tomato itself. Is that true?
Yes, they're actually, interestingly, one of the ways of treating contaminated soil is called phytoremediation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where plants absorb the lead or the metals in the soil. And it's okay if you're not going to eat those plants, but if the plants that you're planning on eating, yes, that can be a problem.
And it's interesting because in integrative medicine, my world, we take probiotics and certain plant-based material to actually absorb toxins. There's actually studies on that. So I'm like fascinated that we do phytoremediation or bioremediation in Superfund sites with probiotics, with bacteria even. As well as plants, and yet we don't even think about doing that in our own gut system, for chemicals. So, just as an aside, I love that kind of connection of how we do it outside, but we have to start thinking about internally as well. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
We've talked about lead paint. We've talked about vapor intrusion. So, you want to know when you're looking at your house, you want to know if there are any Superfund sites in the area. Now, just because you're like in farmland doesn't mean that there's no Superfund sites. A lot of farmers in the old days used to let municipalities or others dump stuff on the back 40. And there have been farms that later became developments, and they had water wells that were contaminated from the prior, contamination. Also, many farms used pesticides in the past, particularly if there were orchards like apple farms, and they have lead arsenate in them. Have been used, and that is very resistant to being degraded in the environment. There's been a number of orchards that have become Superfund sites. Um, there's also been um, homes built near military bases where the military base was used as a training ground for World War II bombers. And I remember one time there was a mobile home park that was built along the old approach path to the bombing target. And the environmental consultant I was representing the lender, and they said, well, that's not a risk, to the environment or to the people living there. And I said, well, uh, this is a practice place, right? They practiced bombing. He said, yeah. I said, well, what made you think all the bombs fell on the X? And there's been places where there have been subdivisions built where kids are bringing unexploded ordnance to show and tell into school. So
Yeah.
you want to know the history of both the property that you're buying and say within a radius of a mile. Because usually if there's contamination, miles about, there have been cases where it's been 2 miles, but for the most part, if you're a mile away, you're generally gonna be okay.
I read that 1 in 10 Americans lives within 10 miles of a contaminated military base. So, we have so many military bases, but 1 in 10 actually lives within, a 10-mile distance from it. So, we're really not as spread apart as Americans as we think we are in terms of these exposure sites, right?
That's current military bases.
Right.
There's lots of inactive sites that have not been investigated. And recently I've been coming across projects that were part of the Manhattan Project was the Manhattan Project that was for development of the atom bomb in World War II, but that wasn't like just in one spot. It was amazing how many places were involved in developing the Manhattan Project in the New York City area. And there's been a couple sites that have had radioactive contamination. They were just in the 50s and 60s. There was economic development. They just there's a couple ways this happens. The government or say utilities will say to the town, hey, I got a great deal for you. Here's some property, and they either make a park out of it or they make a school out of it because they're getting free land. And a lot of times the land is contaminated. So it's not just the active military plants. That we have a lot of historic contaminated sites that we still don't understand the full scope of them. As I said, there's at least 200,000. Estimates are that if we had the money, this is several $billion of cleanup, and it would take till 2040 or 2050 to clean them all up.
So let's talk about a group of chemicals that has gotten a lot of attention recently.
Before we get to that, I just want to mention the other thing for your homes is underground storage tanks. So if your home is going to be heated with oil, petroleum, you want to make sure that the tank hasn't leaked. And there's an easy way to do that. There's a thing you can put in the well to see if it picks up water. And if there's no tank now, you want to find out, was there once a tank? Because just because there's no tank now doesn't mean that there wasn't a tank in the past that leaked. And you have to ask, well, if they shut it down, why did they do that? And sometimes there'll be a tank in the basement, but there was once a tank in the ground. So you want to make sure was there a tank in the ground? And in New Jersey, this has been a particular problem. There's lots of homes that end up contaminated from their old tanks.
How about water, water wells? What would you recommend in terms of someone buying a home that may be not on city water?
Well, you definitely want to have the water fully tested because the water, can have chemicals. The typical potable water test does not test for the chemicals. So you want to make sure that you test for the chemicals. There is a suite of chemicals that can be tested. It's a little more money, but you want to make sure that you do that. And then, of course, there's radon. Radon is actually the second leading cause of lung cancer in the country. And even though Congress passed a law in 1988 to try to minimize the risk of radon, we now have more homes built in radon zones than before that law was passed. So the country is divided into like 3 regions of radon, where the radon region 1 is radon is expected to be above the monitoring range of 4.0 picocuries per liter. But there's no safe exposure to radon. So even if you're so it's radon zone 1, 2, and 3. 3 is there's no radon that's believed to be, and this comes naturally from the rock.
Right. It's a natural nucleotide that lives in the earth. And my understanding is that you can actually have one house with a radon level that's elevated, and then right next door, 0 level. It's almost unusual that you can actually, within even just 2 homes side by side, one can have an abnormal level of radon exposure, and then the next house doesn't. And so, can that be fixed if it is discovered?
Yes, and by the way, this is very similar to vapor intrusion. So it could be the particulars of the building construction. So you can have exceedances of the radon level in different times of the year. So when your buildings are closed in the summer for air conditioning and in the winter for heating, and heating is actually, when you go into an office building in the winter, it's hard to open the doors. That's because of what they call the stack effect. The heat rises like you do with the fireplace. And so it creates, as the heat goes up, it creates a suction or a negative air pressure. That's why it's hard to open up the windows, the door. So if you have radon underneath your home, this suction effect is going to draw the radon into your home. So that's why they take samples in the winter and the summer, because that's the maximum exposure. There is something very, so even in the radon zone 2, I would suggest you do this because, again, any amount of radon is unsafe. And New Jersey has a good radon disclosure law, but there's a very simple solution. You can put on what they call a radon system, which creates a negative air pressure underneath the foundation of the building and vents it out the roof. And also you can do things like sealing cracks, all these openings from the basement foundation into your building, utilities, anything that penetrates the building foundation can be a pathway for the radon to come up. So you want to test for radon as well. And then you were going to go on to the emerging contaminants.
Well, I was going to say, this information is so interesting. Who is responsible for telling a new homeowner about this? Is this an inspector's, responsibility? Is it a realtor's responsibility? In other words, for the average American buying a home, I'm not sure if they'd even know this language, let alone who to ask about it. So where is it disclosed?
So again, some states have property disclosure laws that require all kinds of conditions to be disclosed, including asbestos, lead paint, and radon. In other states, like New Jersey has a radon disclosure law, so you have to disclose the radon. In some states, the brokers, if they are aware of a problem, they have to share it with the buyer. But, like everything else, it's buyer beware. So an educated, remember Sid Sims said an educated buyer was his best customer?
Oh, boy, that's dating us both. Okay, yes.
So really, you need to be proactive and say, there's a couple issues that I'm aware of that I want to make sure that, they pass, they're satisfactory. And I just ticking them off. It's lead paint, asbestos, underground storage tanks, and radon. So those are the 4 primary things. There's also lead in drinking water, which we may have time to talk about. And also, if you have a well, you want to make sure that your well has been tested, not only just for the potable water, which is like the taste and the iron, but for chemicals as well.
Wonderful. I mean, that's a really helpful list. Now, in terms of all the other chemicals, the 90,000 that industrial chemicals that are not tested, that go into our products, that go into, all sorts of stuff that can make its way into our drinking water, which I talk a lot about because this is one of my hot button issues. I know it is for you as well. Do you, number one, there's some ways, Environmental Working Group has a database where you can type in your zip code and actually look up some of the contaminants in your drinking water by zip code. So that's ewg.org. which is a wonderful resource. But, in general, how does one, I would say, decide whether or not to buy a water filter system, not just for their kitchen, maybe just under their sink, but maybe they need a whole house system. What are your recommendations in terms of drinking water if you happen to either already live in a home that has exposures that you didn't anticipate, or you're looking to buy a home and you want to make those kind of decisions?
Well, to start off with, there is a misconception that every chemical that's sold has been tested. In fact, that's not the case. And we're discovering new chemicals that we didn't know previously were harmful to humans. For example, the chemical that was behind Teflon. That chemical was also used on your couches and your rugs to make them stain resistant, on your clothes. For those of us like me who oftentimes stain my clothes, oh, gee, great, I got a stain-resistant clothing. Well, those chemicals can come off in the wash, and then we're learning now that they're called, the short term, the acronym is PFAS. Allie could tell you what the long word is.
Yeah, the perfluoralkyls. It's a big class, perfluoralkyls, and it includes PFOS, PFOA, and so for short is the PFAS chemicals as a group that we're now discovering. There's, I think, over 80 or 100 of them at least that have become not just pervasive in terms of contamination, but also in terms of their study. We now know that they cause a whole host of health issues, which we can go into. But please continue.
And they're also, we're used in firefighting. So if you live near an airport, so we are just learning. Where we learned about vapor intrusion in 1990, we are now at the same place for these emerging contaminants. We have no idea. Some of the and they're not yet regulated at the federal level. So different states have different levels. Some of the standards will show you how stringent it is. Some of the standards are like, if you have one drop in an Olympic-sized pool, that would be the level that they would bar, and that would be the level that could pose risks. Someone once said that they're measuring these contaminants now in parts per trillion. That's another thing that has come up, is that OSHA, people think that their workplaces are safe, and the OSHA regulates the indoor workplace, but their numbers have not been changed since the 1970s. And oftentimes, the standards that are used or established were based on what the technology was available then, not on what was safe. Drinking water standards, for example, are not based solely on health. They're based on economic feasibility. The reason was because municipalities usually are the providers of the drinking water, and they didn't want to bankrupt the municipalities. So they set a level that's a combination of health and economic feasibility. So even though they say this is the level that the Safe Drinking Water Act establishes that's permissible, it doesn't mean that it doesn't pose any risk. It means that was the level that was set.
And actually, what's important about that is that when they're setting these levels, a part of this is how much is consumed by an adult male human being, not by young children, not by pregnant women, not by those with compromised immune system. So, again, old testing for new problems, and a mismatch there in terms of health risks.
Yeah, in fact, there's a movement now as the Superfund program has evolved. We used to, in the early days, they made you dig up all the dirty dirt and treat all the dirty groundwater. But that took forever and was too expensive. So then they started creating what they call risk-based cleanups, where the cleanup is based on the end use of the property. And so residential properties have a different cleanup standard than commercial properties. And the levels are based on some assumptions, as Allie just said. And my joke that I use is that the reason God created risk assessors was to give astrologers credibility. And so how did they come up with a cleanup standard? Well, they have to make an assumption about how long have you been exposed to the contaminant, because it's the dose that is the poison. The dose is a combination of how much over how much time. So they'll say, well, let's see, we're going to say that the average person lives inside 270 days of the year. But if you're in Florida, the regulators there say, well, that's not really true. We'll say 180. So you have a different assumption based on how long you're in the house being exposed. Then they say, as Ali said, well, we got to figure out what is the size of the person that's being consumed here. And in New York, in New Jersey, in the Northeast, they tend to use bigger people as assumptions as opposed to other parts of the country, which means that they can absorb more than you could if you were smaller. And then they say, how long are you going to be living at this house? So some assumptions they say are 70 years, which means that the levels are probably going to be more stringent because they're saying you're having a much longer exposure. But in other parts of the country, they say only 20 years or even 10 years. So the cleanup standards are not zero risk. They are a risk, sort of like what we're doing right now with COVID. What is the acceptable exposure to COVID? We don't know. And just so it's the typical standard that the government has adopted is that the standard will be that it will not result in one excessive cancer in a million people. That's called 10 to the minus 6. Some states allow one excessive cancer in 100,000 or 10,000. That means those numbers would be higher. And the same thing with commercial properties. They'll say, well, you're only there 8 hours a day, you're not there 24/7. So therefore, you can be exposed to more contaminants because you're not going to be exposed as long as you would be if you're living there. So it's I guess I'm just trying to let you know that just because there's a number out there doesn't mean it's 100% safe. And that's why you as a family with a family and you as a buyer just need to approach this with some level of skepticism. I don't want to make you feel paranoid, but I think what did Reagan say? Trust but verify. So
No, I think it's excellent information. And then it's interesting. What triggered my ear was you were talking about the chemicals and the dose makes the poison, which was Paracelsus back in, I don't know, 16th century, 17th century, I think it was. But the dose makes the poison is really the old toxicology way of looking at things, which is, as you are exposed to something in greater and greater dose, you're more likely to have greater and greater risk of health effects or of issues related to that higher dose. Well, in fact, we now know about many chemicals now called endocrine disrupting chemicals. The PFAS chemicals included in those, which is very worrisome, is that at very, very low levels, as you mentioned, parts per trillion, 1 part in a trillion parts, that they can cause some of the same health issues or health concerns as they do when they're at the high dose exposures. So, because that's turning toxicology on its head, it's really changing what we should be thinking in terms of safe levels now. And I think that's part of the battle. That was the battle with lead in terms of how much people could be exposed to. As you remember, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the number kept coming down in terms of EPA's allowance or acceptable level of exposure being harmless. And that's come down dramatically to now to the point where we now know even the World Health Organization acknowledges, amongst others, that there's just no safe level of lead exposure. Yeah. And I think we'll probably, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we're moving in the direction, given what we know about these PFAS chemicals and how pervasive and how they don't break down because of the fluorine component to it, that we're going to start to see that lower and lower levels of exposure are going to be needed as we move forward to show people that it's just not a safe group of chemicals at all.
And yet, I think 98% of us have it in our bloodstream right now?
Yep, that is correct.
Someone once said to me that a part per trillion is equivalent to 1 second in 30 years. So that if you've lived 30 years, like it's 1 second in your life. That's the equivalent. I mean, the parts per trillion are such a small number. And when you're starting to regulate at that level, I mean, even I want to go back for a second for asbestos. I don't want to unduly scare people. The fact that your home might have asbestos by itself is not a scary thing. There's 2 types of asbestos. There's asbestos, which is friable that you can crush, and then non-friable, and asbestos, like in floor tiles, is considered non-friable. It will only present a risk if it's damaged. Same thing if you have asbestos in pipe wrap. Sometimes the act of removing it is actually more dangerous than leaving it in place and just making sure it's in good condition. You don't want to put anything next to it that could damage it. But so if you have a home that you're looking at and it has asbestos wrapping, just You don't necessarily have to remove it, because removing it's going to require a pretty expensive. You have to basically create a negative air pressure within the space. People come in with moon suits have to remove it, and if as long as it's in good condition, you're not adding any further exposure to your family than if you were removing it completely. So that's one of the cost benefit analysis you have to do. I just want to make sure that people are not unduly scared by the mere presence. It's good to know that it's there so that you know how to manage it, but you don't have to have it removed.
Larry, what are some of the practical resources you would suggest people, we want to try to find vetted, unbiased, legitimate organizations or websites that maybe people can look up for some of these issues, especially with realty and buying new homes and businesses. What do you suggest? Is there anything you can think of that are legit and reasonable?
Well, I mean, I think for some of it depends on the substance. Like I think you're right. EWG was good for the PFAS. EPA's website still, they have plenty of materials. So you go to EPA.gov, and then you can plug in asbestos or lead paint. I mean, the underlying information is that they actually usually have, like, lead paint. They have really good brochures that you can get. Lead in drinking water. Um, I still, for the most part, the published materials are still good for educational purposes. Your states are also going to have on their state websites, um, you know, information, but that's what I use, and they tend to have materials that are written for the layperson, so that
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to know what the chemical is and why it's causing a problem. Just what should I be concerned about, and how can I protect my family?
Yeah, and I was just looking up in my own book because I actually forget how much
Oh, your
details.
book too, right? Your book. That's
Well,
right.
well, no, it's interesting because we have a whole section on Superfund sites and especially military bases. We talk about Camp Lejeune as one of the examples of a really horrific story in our history, but it's continuing on at military bases in terms of PFAS contamination and other chemicals. But we did put in a bunch of information about ways to look up Superfund sites in this country, and locating where they might be even by zip code. There are resources here. So I just want people to know that if that's something you're concerned with, we do have that in the book, non-toxic.
Yeah,
Kind of
you can
yeah,
go to the EPA Superfund page. There is a place that says Superfund sites where I live, and you
yep.
click in there, um, and then you'll have a zip code, and they'll show you how far they are. But that's just telling you if it's an area. But those are things that you should just do on your own, just to make sure. Even if you're buying, as I said, buying a farm, buying a house that's next to a farm, and there's also this thing called ECHO that EPA uses. It's a database of all the violations and all the permits and everything that a facility nearby has, so you can see if there's been any violations. And then, of course, each state has a list of Superfund sites that you can see if they've been cleaned up, what their status is. I mean, it's a little time consuming, but it's there, and it's if you live in an area that's close to a Superfund site, um, you can register to be notified of any developments with that site. There is public participation on cleanups, and so the state will have a list of people that they give information to, and you generally create a website for that particular site.
And so, Larry, what's the difference between a Superfund site and a brownfield site? And the other thing is, in terms of remediation, I actually saw a site actively being remediated, and they were digging, I believe, 3 feet of soil up. And they had it all fenced off, and they told me that was their requirement. So could you just give some insight into that?
Sure. So a brownfield site is a site that's believed to be contaminated or is contaminated, but it's not contaminated enough to be on the Superfund list. And so when the Superfund law was passed, because owners and operators can be held liable for all the costs associated with the cleanup, regardless of whether they caused the contamination or not, they're liable by status, which means they're strictly liable for everything that happened back to the Civil War, for example. So that caused people to be afraid to buy these urban commercial properties, or that either commercial or manufacturing, dry cleaners, gas stations, afraid they were going to be buying contamination. So states have created these brownfield programs for the sites that are not as seriously contaminated as the Superfund sites, and they can be cleaned up. They get a no further action letter, which protects them from being sued. But they also employ the use of what I call risk-based cleanup. So the cleanups are based on the use of the property. They can allow residential properties to be built on these contaminated sites and not remove all the contamination. For example, in New York, we have 3 different cleanup tracks. We actually have 4, but no one uses the third one. And track 1 means that all the dirty dirt has been removed and the groundwater satisfies cleanup standards, drinking water standards. Track 2 is that cleanup there's 15 feet of clean fill, or the contamination down to 15 feet has been removed. Groundwater may not be achieved, but they have a control in place, which I'll talk about in a second, that prohibits the use of the groundwater. And then the last one is track 4, where there's 2 feet of clean fill. So only the top 2 feet of contaminated soil is removed. Same thing with the groundwater, you can't use it. Now, so you can build apartment buildings, multifamily mixed use on these properties. They don't allow track 4 or track 2. Well, track 4 is not allowed on single family homes. Now, so there's these brownfield programs, and what they do is, because they allow contamination to be left in place, it's cheaper to clean up. But there's also post-remedial obligation. So the owners of the property, there's going to be some sort of restriction put on the property. Sometimes it says don't use it for residential purposes, or don't use the groundwater, for example. And then each year you have to show that you're complying with these restrictions. So if it's a multifamily development, the condo association, or in New York City, the co-op association, is going to be required to file these annual notices that they're complying with the restriction. It could be the parking lot has to be maintained, because that's the barrier between the dirty dirt and the people, and say you can't use groundwater. So those are the brownfield programs. They're very popular. That they're actually bringing use back to these abandoned properties. They help to do infill construction, so we don't have urban sprawl, which contributes to climate change. So the programs are good, just that you have to understand. And the cleanup standards have been vetted. So presumably, as long as the controls are left in place, they are safe. What was the other question you wanted me to?
No, I think that's interesting about how they're remediated and how they're listed sort of separately than Superfund sites, and that almost adds to the bigger risk in some ways, because now we know that it's not just the Superfund sites. Of course, it's kind of the lower level contaminations, which still can be harmful. And what's interesting to me is, the whole full circle back to why, how we met. We have these, historical contamination and things that have been in the soil for a while. But, here I have an ongoing real-time issue with glyphosate spraying, which we know is a probable carcinogen. It's under a great deal of scrutiny. Mexico just got rid of glyphosate, which is Roundup, in case people don't know that. Europe is looking to ban it. It's been banned from every major park in public park in Miami. It's certainly on the docket for New York parks as well. And yet here I am in New Jersey, trying to battle out whether or not I get sprayed once or twice a year, 10 feet from my children's bedroom windows. And so, we have ongoing battles that we still have to kind of fight the fight. And when you move into a new environment, I think it's also worthwhile to really find out, it's beautiful where we live. It's, idyllic. Looks like an old fashioned farm town with, people going out to milk cows. But in fact, it actually has a very long history in central New Jersey, where I'm at, of having, spraying, potato farm spraying, aerial spraying. It's in the soil. And of course now modern day chemicals like glyphosate that we're hoping, personally and with my colleagues to really get rid of in our environment. So, it pays to be a good consumer and a thoughtful consumer as to what is currently being, causing us contamination as well. Wouldn't you agree?
One of the things that's been fascinating is, so we got environmental laws were enacted in the 70s and 70s mainly. In response to the fact that the common law, the law that was evolved, we got from England, was not sufficient to address the modern problem of chemical contamination. So ideas about negligence and trespass and nuisance were not viewed as being adequate, didn't provide adequate remedies to people that are being exposed, um, and also property owners whose property has been contaminated by someone else. And we're kind of going back now where because the environmental laws still have gaps in them. Now we're going back, and so there are a whole class of so there's lawyers that specialize in what we call toxic torts. So they will bring lawsuits on behalf of people either who have been exposed to contamination and are likely to become sick or are sick, or their property values have gone down because of the proximity of the contamination. So these are toxic tort lawyers, and they're very good at what they do. And they will actually, when the law does not provide an adequate remedy, people turn to these lawyers to fill the gap. And we're actually entering what we call the era of super tort. So the tort, T-O-R-T, that tort is the notion that you can get a remedy for a wrongdoing. And so now we're seeing massive lawsuits being filed against the manufacturers of the PFAS. I mean, you're talking about
that's the Dark Waters movie with Bob Billett, a famous lawyer that took them on, and it stars Mark Ruffalo. In case people have heard of it, yep.
We have towns and cities suing the manufacturers of PCBs because there's still, even though PCBs were banned in 1976, they are still everywhere. They're still in transformers, and they're still contaminating drinking water. And towns are having to, especially out west, where they're having droughts and they're having drinking water is going to be a major problem in the 21st century, access to safe drinking water. And so they're trying to get the lack of adequate enforcement and adequate regulatory framework. They're now using nuisance laws to try to force, was they saying these companies are creating a nuisance by having these chemicals in the environment. And of course, they're trying to use nuisance to address climate change in the absence of federal action. I don't think nuisance is the right remedy for that particular issue, but this is what, a lot of times lawyers, we make up new law, and sometimes we are ahead of things, sometimes we're behind. So just want to let you know. So if you do have a situation where you feel that you are being exposed, I'm not the right kind of lawyer because I work on transactions and regulatory stuff. You want a lawyer that specializes in toxic torts, and they're all over the place. You can just plug in toxic tort lawyer, and you'll see. Think about, this is not meant to be a plug, but White and Luxembourg. They're the kinds of law firms that specialize in this area because you want someone there's very unique issues that deal with proof and evidence, and these lawyers deal with that every day. The rest of us, we don't. So you want to have some lawyers that specialize in this area that could they're going to want to get a bunch of people together and bring a class action suit.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because, believe it or not, even in my town, I have people who know what I do now and write what I write, come up to me and say, we have 2 kids that were adopted and they both got cancer. And that neighborhood has some cancer cases. And, can we put something together? And my experience, having explored this, is that it's very, very difficult. I mean, look at Camp Lejeune, a case where we have so much evidence that was so much harm done to unborn fetuses and to a whole list of cancers that came from exposure to those contaminated wells. And yet U.S. government hasn't even, acknowledged wrongdoing. They haven't remediated. They haven't given money to these families. And so you can see that it's a really uphill battle unless you get the right people on board. But I think that's really helpful because now people even know the semantics of how to even go forward and trying to search this out. I personally, I don't know how you feel about drinking water. If we just get down to sort of an individual's, health and wellness, I personally say everyone should be filtering their water. I wrote a whole chapter on drinking water to give people a whole spectrum of filtration options, but I personally recommend a reverse osmosis water filter since it's just the most aggressive type of water filtration, doesn't take up a lot of space, isn't expensive anymore if you get a good one that's vetted. What are your thoughts on your own personal drinking water and knowing what you know with all your history?
I use filtered water, and I had kidney cancer several
Hmm.
years ago. I was very lucky; I caught it early, and I joked that it was because I grew up in New Jersey. New Jersey has one of the leading clusters of kidney cancer,
Hmm.
and it's very hard to tease out how much. So when you're trying to hold a company liable, it's hard. The test is, how do I tease out the particular contaminant that we are alleging caused the cancer versus the exposures you're getting every day? And is it the exposures you got that actually brought it over to cancer as opposed to just, the exposure? But I definitely filter water. Um, I, um, I use, a regular filter.
Carbon filter, probably,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Now, of course, carbon filter is not going to filter everything. So I think you should at the very least do that. And then Allie's actually the better person to to recommend what types of. But I would never, even if you live in New York City, there's a problem of lead in water, and your tap water at night. If you have the odds are, if you live in New York City, that you're being supplied water that has lead, using lead pipes. And
Does that
in
make the bagels taste better? Because I've heard that argument.
well,
Seriously, I've heard that argument. Not for the lead, but at least New York water makes the best bagels because of its water. And I'm thinking, oh boy, I don't think I want those bagels anymore.
actually, bagels and pizza, because it's based on the hardness of the water. So when I lived in California, I knew pizza places that actually imported their pizza dough from New York because the pizza wasn't rising enough with the water, the type of water hardness they had in California. Anyway, what was I
You
saying?
were saying lead in New York water.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So it's important. So you can have lead in the water that's in the pipes coming into your building. You could have lead in the pipes in your building and in your faucets, particularly if you have brass faucets. Brass faucets have lead in them. So even in 1986, Congress banned the use, required lead-free piping in buildings built from 86 on, but the term lead-free didn't mean no lead. It's, I think, 0.08 lead. Um, so the best thing to do is first in the morning when you use your water. Um, you need to run it for at least 2 minutes, um, sometimes 5 minutes. 5 minutes would be the safest, but at least 2 minutes before you use it. Um,
And
and
that's to get the stagnant water that may be accumulating some of that lead contamination from old piping.
Right. But if you take a shower, if your kids take a shower in the morning and they go to drink some of the shower water, again, you want to flush the water from each different faucet. So if you flush the faucet in the kitchen and then your kid goes to take a shower, that water should run for at least 5 minutes, because you don't, again, kids are gonna, you know, open their mouth up to the shower maybe. Um, so lead in drinking water is a problem. It's a major societal problem because no landlord has ever been held liable for lead in drinking water, even though they own the pipes in the building. It's one of the things that we hold landlords liable for the lead in the paint, but they're not liable for the lead in the pipes. The idea meaning that it's the water coming into the building that's causing the lead to leach out if it's not properly treated. So it's a major societal problem. Some cities are, what happened with Flint? Flint is just one example. Newark has the same problem, and Newark has a 10-year plan to replace their pipes, which doesn't really do a lot of good for the kids that are under 10 right now, or under 6. Basically, it means with another generation, the kids are going to be exposed to lead. So the best you can do if you are in a building that's got old pipes is to run the water, put a filter on. But lead in drinking water is, and if you're buying a house, if your house is built before 1978, you're going to have lead paint, and if it's built before 86, you're definitely going to have lead pipes. So don't buy brass faucets.
Yeah, no, I think this is great information. And again, I've actually said this about Newark since I'm so close to Newark. And of course, lead is pervasive in terms of its risk. And even schools don't even test it. There's no federal mandate to test lead in schools, even at their water fountains. But I've always said, if you get something as much as even a reverse osmosis, any filter, but a reverse osmosis now are about $250 or $300, and they pay themselves back. So you're not schlepping home pallets of bottled plasticized water, which people don't realize that you actually can pay that off pretty quickly just by putting in that with a plumber. So which is only about $130 for 1 hour for a plumber. So it's just another option if people are interested. But Larry, I could literally talk to you all day. I mean, I have like a million questions. I think we had a call before this even, we even had this podcast just to get to know each other. And I wanted to stay on the phone as well. But I will tell you this, it has been really interesting. You have taught me so much. And, tell our audience how they can get in touch with you, or if they wanted to, or where you can be found. And also tell them about LinkedIn, because I read a lot of your good stuff on LinkedIn, actually.
So if you want to get hold of me, I have an email. It's Larry@Schnapf Law. That's SCHNAP as in Peter, F as in Frank, law.com. My website is schnapflaw.com. On my website, I have a lot of information about vapor intrusion. I also have on my website a section called The Bible and the Environment, which we didn't have time to talk about today. We'll talk about some other time maybe. And it basically, for those who have suspicions about environmental regulation, it kind of walks us through the Bible and suggests what the Bible's commands are for us with respect to the environment, both now and for future generations. And I have actually lots of information about dry cleaners on my website as well. And then I do have a LinkedIn page. I post news articles every day about environmental issues of interest. I have my general LinkedIn page, and then I have environmental issues and business transactions, which also I post more stuff about Superfund and stuff more related to issues that people that are dealing with transactions would be like. If you're buying a home, that might be the better page for you. But if you just want to know about environmental issues in general, just my LinkedIn page is fine. I also have a Facebook, Schnapf LLC, which I kind of focus on New York and New Jersey stuff. I don't use that as often, but so those are some places that you could contact me.
That's wonderful. I mean, I really think that's great, because I think most people listening might even have more questions just like I do. So, so wonderful to have you. It was such a pleasure to give us this perspective, much needed, especially now with all of our changing environmental issues, of course. Thank you again, Larry Schnapf, for being with me, environmental lawyer and adjunct professor of environmental law at New York Law School. We really, it was just really exciting to have you on. And I'm going to actually put some of the links that you described on the description for the podcast, so that people will be able to find that there as well. So thank you again, Larry, and have a wonderful day. I hope baseball season picks up sometime soon for you. I'm a
Yankee fan, so every this is my favorite time of the year usually.
Okay, well, good. We're rooting for the baseball. We're rooting for you being a good fan out there again. So, so thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Okay.